All right, we're going to dive into a side of Charles Darwin you probably never learned about in school. It's a story about science, yeah, but it's also about empire and the incredible human cost of a so-called civilizing mission. So let's start with Darwin's own words. This one sentence, written late in his life, really captures the whole conflict at the heart of our story. Here you have a man from a society built on hierarchy, and he's suddenly hit with this undeniable evidence of a shared humanity. I mean, we all have this image of Darwin, right? The brilliant naturalist, the father of evolution. But underneath that familiar portrait, there's a much more complicated and honestly much darker narrative. It really forces us to look at that uncomfortable place where scientific discovery and colonial ambition crash into each other. To really get this part of the story, you have to understand that it didn't even begin with Darwin. Nope. It started with the captain of the HMS Beagle and his grand and ultimately pretty tragic idea. Captain Robert FitzRoy, he was the architect of this whole thing. He truly believed he could take an act of abduction and spin it as some kind of noble project, what he actually called a civilizing mission. His plan was to take Indigenous people, totally remake them in England's image, and then return them as, well, as agents of cultural change. And here's what's so crucial to get from this timeline. Darwin walks into the story after the most traumatic stuff has already gone down. In 1830, 4 people from Tierra del Fuego are taken hostage. When they get to England, they're treated like curiosities, like minor celebrities by the press. And tragically, before Darwin even sets foot on the Beagle, one of them had already died, a victim of this profound, violent uprooting. And this just perfectly shows that first act of erasure. These weren't just some anonymous savages. They were real people from distinct groups, the Kawaiskar and the Amana. But their real names? Gone. Replaced with English ones, like Jemmy Button. Names that made them sound more like characters in a story than actual human beings. So let's bring Darwin into the picture and see how this all creates this huge internal conflict for him. He stepped into a situation that was already in motion, and what he saw, well, it would challenge him for the rest of his life. This is such a key detail. Darwin didn't meet these people in their own environment. His first encounter was with Fuegians who were already wearing English clothes, speaking a bit of English, and had been taught Christian customs. He was seeing the results of the experiment, not the raw, painful beginning. And you can just see how this created this massive split in his thinking. On one hand, you read his journals, and they're filled with the racist colonial language of his time. He calls them savages. But on the other hand, his scientific mind just couldn't ignore what was right in front of him. He was completely fascinated by their intelligence, their ability to learn and adapt, to reason, to be in every single way that matters human. You know, this internal battle, this tension between his prejudice and his own observations, it ended up pushing Darwin toward one of his most revolutionary ideas. He concluded that despite all the cultural differences, all people, everywhere, share a single common origin. It's kind of ironic, right? This experience born from such a violent act actually helped shape a core idea of modern biology. Okay, so this all leads us to the big climax of the story, the return journey. Captain FitzRoy was convinced he was about to prove his whole theory of civilization. But the reality was going to be something else entirely. The goal couldn't have been clearer. FitzRoy was going to drop off these individuals, now remade in England's image, and they would then spread Christianity, English customs, you name it, among their people. They were supposed to be living, breathing proof of British superiority. Yeah, that's not what happened. Not even close. Within just a few months of being back in Tierra del Fuego, Jemmy Button and the others had shed their European clothes and were fully back living in their communities. From FitzRoy's point of view, the experiment was a complete, humiliating failure. But Darwin, he sighed differently. To him, this wasn't a failure. It wasn't a step backward. He realized he was watching this profound act of restoration. It was a reclaiming of self, of culture, of home. And it just shattered that colonial assumption that one way of life is automatically better than another. So this story from almost 200 years ago, it's not just some historical footnote. Today, people are actively working to reframe it, to shift focus away from the famous Englishmen and onto the people whose lives were turned upside down. A great example of this is the animated film Darwin's Notebook. It completely reimagines these events from the perspective of the Fuegians themselves. It takes them from being side characters in Darwin's story and puts them right at the center of their own, giving them back their voice. And when you look at it from this new angle, it forces you to ask some really tough questions. When we hear a word like civilizing in history, what are we not seeing? What violence, what loss is being hidden behind that seemingly noble language? And this also makes us think about how we remember figures like Darwin. How do we celebrate his incredible scientific mind while also admitting that he was part of a deeply prejudiced and exploitative system? Is it possible to hold both of those truths at the same time? Because this isn't just about the past. This story is like a mirror, and it reflects issues that we are still dealing with right now. So, what's the takeaway? Well, this story forces us to ask who gets to be the hero in the stories of science and discovery. It's this powerful reminder that progress is never simple. It often comes with a terrible human price tag. And finally, it just exposes the incredible arrogance of thinking one culture has any right to erase another. And that brings us right to the essential takeaway here, a truth that Darwin himself started to grasp through this whole complicated and messy journey. In the end, there is no hierarchy. There are no higher or lower people. There's just one human family with a single origin, endlessly and beautifully shaped by all the different places and histories in our world.